You're listening to The Virtuous Mind, a podcast from Providence Christian College that discusses all facets of the human experience and the liberal arts from a biblical worldview. I'm your host, Dr. David E. Alexander. What is a woman? A recent documentary asked this question, and many so-called experts in academia, medicine, and psychology gave answers that were startling. But perhaps there is a better, deeper question for us to ask. What is a human? In this episode of The Virtuous Mind, we sit down with Dr. Carl Trueman, author of the book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. In that work, as well as subsequent books and articles, Trueman attempts to explain how our culture arrived at a place where it no longer thinks it absurd to believe that a woman might be trapped in a man's body. Dr. Trueman and I will discuss various developments since the writing of his bestseller, the lessons we need to learn from the lightning-fast changes occurring in our culture, and how the church can respond with gospel grace and truth. Dr. Trueman, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on, David.
Here's one way that I sort of prep your book for my students. I tell the students that for the most part, your entire 400-page plus book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, could be read by someone who is an advocate of the LGBTQ movement and be illuminated, right, to how the culture has arrived at this moment where for the most part, the culture is sort of all in embracing of the LGBTQ position. I say that as praise for the book, right? That it's just an incredible intellectual history helping us understand how we got to where we are right now. What do you think of that as a characterization?
Well, in many ways, that's what I was aiming for. I wanted to write a book that explained how we arrived at the situation we're in order then for that to be a platform for thinking of how we might respond. But again, as I wrote the book, I had in my mind, I teach at a college, almost certainly in a college of 2,500 students. I'm going to have some students in class for whom this is their issue or they're struggling with this, whether publicly or privately. And I want to write a book that I could recommend to them with good conscience in terms of they're not going to feel dismissed by this. They're not going to feel it's a polemic against them. I want them to be able to read the book in order to be able to understand perhaps why they think the way they do in the context in which they find themselves. And interesting enough, Andrew Sullivan had me on his program. We ended up not talking so much about the book as about gay marriage as it happened, because we recorded the program on the day that President Biden was sort of inscribing gay marriage into law. But the reason why Andrew had originally asked me onto his podcast was he said, and for the listeners who don't know Andrew Sullivan, he's an influential conservative-ish journalist, but he's also openly gay and one of the, in some ways, architects of the popular case for gay marriage. Some 15 years ago. Andrew invited me onto his program because he said he agreed with an awful lot of what I said in my book. So I think your analysis, I'm glad you read it that way, and it confirms me in thinking that, yeah, I managed to achieve something of what I was trying to achieve. And that was an explanatory book before it was a polemical book.
Your book, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self and then Strange New World, those are a couple years old now. Where do you see things developing in maybe different ways, surprising ways, maybe predictable ways since you wrote those two books?
First of all, the thing that's most surprised me, and it was beginning to happen by the time the book was being completed, but was not yet quite as big a thing as it has become. I think the whole arrival of rapid onset gender dysphoria as something that disproportionately affects young girls round about the age of puberty. Didn't expect that. So that's been one major phenomenon. It's become something of a battleground, of course, the arrival of puberty blockers, surgeries for minors. These are big political questions now. So didn't expect that.
What is rapid onset gender dysphoria?
Well, there's a basic distinction in gender dysphoria between what they call early onset gender dysphoria and rapid onset gender dysphoria. Early onset gender dysphoria would refer to somebody who, say, from the age of 4 or 5, they think they're, they're biologically a girl, but they think they're a boy, or they're biologically a boy, but they think they're a girl. So, if you like, it's I would say, a long-standing psychiatric condition which emerges very early on. Rapid onset gender dysphoria is this phenomenon that Abigail Schreier really looks at in her great book, Irreversible Damage, which seems to sort of suddenly emerge rather fast round about puberty and disproportionately affects young girls as opposed to young boys. And that's interesting because one of the things, I don't deal with this at all in the books, but one of the things that intrigues me about that is that looks very much like standard body discomfort, body dysmorphia affecting teenagers, particularly girls. We had it in the 70s, 80s, early 90s with anorexia and bulimia. Now that same demographic group is being affected by gender stuff. And I would just say, it's taking a step back from those two things. I would say probably we're looking at, when we look at early onset gender dysphoria and rapid onset gender dysphoria, I'm not a medic, but I suspect we're looking at two different phenomena there.
Yeah.
The latter, the evidence, the early anecdotal evidence suggests that the latter is almost certainly a social contagion. It's driven by wanting to belong to a group. My colleague at the EPPC, Mary Rice Hassan, has this interesting chart where she shows where rapid onset gender dysphoria takes off. It's at exactly the same time as social media becoming a thing. Just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean that they stand in causal relationship to each other. That's not necessary. But if I were a betting man, I'd put my money on social media being an extremely potent influence in the phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria. So that's one thing I didn't see. I didn't expect, I'm actually a little more optimistic now than I was when I wrote the book, in that I think we're beginning to see, particularly in Europe, significant pushback coming, particularly against the rapid onset gender dysphoria type stuff, particularly against the idea of puberty blockers and traumatic, life-changing surgery for minors. Just this week, I don't know when this podcast will be released, but the week we're actually recording, Britain's health service has declared that it will no longer allow the prescription of puberty blockers to minors. That's interesting, because at the very time that Europe is starting to pull back from the excesses, America and Canada seem to be full steam ahead. But I'm hopeful that the pushback we're seeing in Europe will come to the United States as well. So there were two things I didn't see, either the explosion of rapid onset gender dysphoria or kind of signs of the turning of the tide on the T question in a good way. Transgenderism, in a sense, it affects everybody. Now, I'd want to argue that gay marriage does affect everybody, but it affects everybody less directly. If I'm living, if in my street, there's a couple of gay guys next to me living together, and they mow their lawn, and they don't party late at night, and they pay their bills, it doesn't affect me. It's no different in some ways to two guys who just happen to be renting a house together, living together. But transgenderism, it encroaches on women's private spaces. It encroaches on women's safety. It encroaches on parental rights. It encroaches on women's sports. It's encroaching on the workplace in terms of demands for specification of and use of preferred pronouns. I can live my life in a world where there's gay marriage and it doesn't have too much of an effect on me. Transgenderism, particularly when pushed by activists, it penetrates every sphere of society, even down to the household, where, okay, if you're a parent who doesn't affirm the chosen identity of your child, there have been attempts made, for example, in California, to pass laws that would allow your children to be removed from you. Thankfully, so far, we've not seen too much success in the United States on that front. But transgenderism is a tool that can be used in a very, very aggressive way to come for everybody. And I think that too has become more and more clear. When I got involved in the transgender stuff in 2016 in my local school district, I couldn't get any parents to take it seriously. I couldn't get
Yeah.
them to realize that this is actually going to really affect you. And it was, no, we just want the kids to be happy. And then suddenly it dawns that, oh, my child, my daughter's going to be using a bathroom and there's going to be a guy in the bathroom. My daughter, who's, runs for the school, is going to find that relatively mediocre male athletes are excluding her from her possibility of running from the school because they just happen to be biologically stronger and faster. It really has emerged, I think, in the last decade that this thing affects everybody. It's hard to hide from.
What have you seen in terms of the church's response to this? Maybe some positive responses, things that best practices, let's call them,
Yeah.
and maybe some ways in which the church has either failed to engage the issue effectively or maybe engage the issue really ineffectively.
I think we need to be very charitable on the front of how the church and how individual Christians responded to this.
Mm,
It's happened so fast. It's hard to think through. And I think we have to allow people to make what, in retrospect, will appear to be mistakes,
mm,
but at the time seemed like good enough answers, or answers given out of only, having part of the information or part of the story. So I do think there's a need in the church for, I would say, charity to really inform our discussion at this point, because there's a lot of, I would say, work in progress going on. If you'd asked me the question, for example, about should I use somebody's preferred pronouns 5 years ago, I might have given a different answer to the answer I'd give today, because
yeah.
frankly, I hadn't thought about it very much. Uh, so I think we'd have to say that the moment in a lot of churches, there's not a particularly unified response. There is a spectrum, as on the gay issue, so there's a spectrum on the trans issue. Uh, Secondly, I think I'd also want to make a distinction between the ideology and individuals. There's a
Mm,
sense in
mm,
which in the church we need to speak very strongly against the ideology driving these things. On the other hand, we need to realize, I've never chatted to somebody struggling with gender dysphoria who's particularly happy about it. I know we see the drag queens, etc., on the TV, glorying in it. My personal experience is that by and large, the people I've met, this is agony to them. It's
yeah.
something they're really struggling with. So I think as Christians, we need to be compassionate. Now, we need to be careful, of course, that compassion doesn't just become an excuse for affirming people in their delusions or in their struggles. We have to be very, very careful about that. And I think it's striking the balance between what I would describe as being loving and supporting in a Christian way without that bleeding over into a kind of
Mm,
uncritically affirming. It's getting that's proving to be somewhat hard. And so we would say, for example, I would know some Christians who would disagree with me on the pronouns question. If you ask me, should I use somebody's preferred pronouns if they don't match up with their biological sex? I would say, well, if they're standing on the ledge of a building about to throw themselves off, and the only way I can talk them in is for 30 seconds, use their preferred pronouns to get them in, I'm going to do it.
mm,
As a normative way of interacting with them, though, no. And my reasons would not simply be because I'm affirming them in what I would regard as an incorrect view of reality. But I've also come to the conclusion that if, let's say, you're a man and you want me to refer to you use a woman's pronouns, um, if I do that, not only am I affirming you in a delusion, I'm insulting every other woman on the face of the planet.
mm.
I'm saying that women's bodies actually have nothing to do with being a woman. So I think there's a lot of stuff. And go back to your question, what has the church done badly? I've not seen that second half really included in a lot of church discussions. A lot of church discussion about pronouns tends to focus on helping the person, affirming the person, are we confirming them in a lie, etc., etc. I think the church needs to think much more broadly as well. When it answers questions of how to deal with individuals, we need to be thinking about, and what are we doing with everybody else when we take this stand or position? I think on the gay issue, I do myself now think that the discussion about whether a Christian can identify as as gay, that's ended in my mind. I think we've done our best to try to persuade Christians who think that's a legitimate way of going. The discussion is over now. All the arguments on both sides have been made. So I think that that discussion is over. I do think that a lot of churches, I can imagine my own church, and this is not a criticism of my own church because I'm part of that church. It's a criticism of me too. I think if somebody comes in who's, was a man, but they've had an operation and they're now presenting as a woman, I think many of us would struggle with how to interact with that person.
Mm.
I have no trouble interacting with gay people who cross my path. I find it so counterintuitive to engage with somebody who I can tell is a man, but is presenting as a woman. I think that's something the church has got to wrestle with. How do we treat that person as a human being without affirming them in what they've done to their body and what they're claiming about their identity? So I think there's a whole heap of stuff out there, some of which the church has, I think, done well and come to a good settled position on in some cases. Other things that are going to be with us for a long, long time as we wrestle through them.
I teach on the Vice tradition every so often. It's actually been a while that I've done it, and I'm a big defender of the privation theory of evil. I'm not married to it in the same way that I'm married to the doctrine of the Trinity. So, I'll give it up before I'd give up the doctrine of the Trinity, of course, but I'm pretty convinced by the privation theory of evil. And, basically, just so listeners have some kind of understanding of it, the privation theory of evil says that all instances of badness in the world are actually instances of an absence of a good thing that should be present, right? So blindness is bad in a human because sight is supposed to be present. The fact that my chair can't see is not a bad thing because chairs are not supposed to see. So there's an absence of sight in the chair and there's an absence of sight in the human. In the one case, it's bad because sight should be present. In the other case, it's not bad because sight is not supposed to be present. So that's a very, very rough, quick and dirty sort of presentation of the privation theory of evil. What I think that I find interesting, and I try to ask myself when it comes to a lot of these very controversial, difficult to understand, gut-wrenching types of issues, is the following, and I'm curious to hear your take on this. What is it that the transgender movement, what is the good thing that is being perverted, right? What is the precise thing, the precise good that is being distorted by this particular movement? And as believers, as Christians, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? I want to hold on to the good thing while acknowledging and ditching the perverted thing. And so there's some obvious goods that are getting perverted, but maybe there's some unobvious ones that are worth our attention.
Rapid onset gender dysphoria provides us with a good example of that. I remember chatting to a young man a couple of years ago who came to see me and was telling me that his big thing was he'd become convinced he was a woman trapped in a man's body. And so I just said to him, well, okay, tell me how and when you started feeling this way. Let's go back to the beginning, and you just talk me through it so I get a handle on where you're coming from. And he gave me this story, a kind of sad story about when he was at school. The boys bullied him, and the girls allowed him to play their games. And it was a much more elaborate story than that. But the bottom line was, even without me prompting him, it was a kind of Socratic discussion. I just asked him a few questions, and he sort of led the way. He came to the conclusion at the end of our discussion that, I think actually my specific gender dysphoria is all down to the fact that I wanted to belong. I wanted to fully belong to the group of people who'd been kind to me. I wanted to find community. So using your deprivation theory, I would say in that case, he was a young man that his desire was to belong. To value others and to be valued by others. And that's a basic human desire. We all know that our own sense of self-worth is so much based upon how other people treat us. You get treated badly, we feel badly. Get treated well, we feel good. So that would be an example. And I would say that may well fit with the social contagion idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria, because we have a generation arising for whom community, as I knew it in a sort of pre-social media, smartphone age, was a good thing, but they don't have that anymore. Might add, I was thinking of another example. I was chatting to a young life worker a couple of years ago, came to my office at Grove, and we were talking, and I was asking him how his ministry was going among local high school kids. And he made some comment to the effect, I think he was working among sort of 12 to 14-year-olds. And he made some comment about one of the classes of kids he was dealing with, 80% of the girls identified as lesbian.
Mm.
And it was a kind of, wow, that's amazingly out of proportion with what you'd expect from the typical population. And I asked him why, and he gave me two reasons, one of which doesn't really apply to the question you've asked. One of which was, well, it's not cool to be straight anymore.
Yep.
It's the equivalent of wearing the wrong clothes to school, having the wrong haircut. But the other answer he gave was, I think, very interesting. He said, we don't have a category of friendship anymore.
Yep.
And our young people, two 13-year-old girls, it's not a surprise that they would have strong and passionate feelings for each other. And it's not surprising that as going through puberty, those feelings can be very intense and quite confusing. But we live in a world where we don't have a category of friendship anymore.
Yep.
The only grammar and syntax we give to young people for thinking about these feelings is a sexualized one. So again, going back to your deprivation theory, it's good for people to be friends. God speaks to Moses as a man speaks to his friend. Jesus in the upper room discourse declares that his disciples, no longer do I call you servants, now I call you friends. Now we don't have the concept of friendship. And even in the church, we struggle with that, because I can't imagine when Charles Spurgeon or even Martin Lloyd-Jones preached on David and Jonathan, they ever felt the need to tell the congregation, of course, my love for you is deeper than that for women, is not a gay statement. If I was preaching on that text today, I'd feel obliged to actually say, by the way, please don't read this in any homosexual way, because our world has taken the good of friendship and totally sexualized it. So, David, I think actually that the privation theory of evil is a great way of thinking about these things. I'd not thought about it in those terms before, but I think there are two examples where we might say, well, yeah, the LGBT group movements are sort of getting hold of goods, but they have no content to put in them. And so they've ended up being an utter perversion of the original good. Like all heresies. Why do heresies gain ground? Because they grasp something of the truth that has perhaps been neglected. And we certainly want to say that emotions are important. When I teach Rousseau in class, I always say to the students, Rousseau's onto something, in that if I look out the window and I see an old lady being beaten up by a gang of hooligans and I don't feel anything, we all know there's something wrong. If I have to Google, is it good or bad that old ladies get beaten up, or I have to look up what the law is on that, we're going to say, well, we have a word for you. You're a psychopath. That's not a good thing. So certainly emotions, I think, is an important component. And I think particularly conservative Protestants, we can tend to prioritize the mind, partly because of our history, that a lot of, particularly the last 100 years, the debates in the kind of conservative Protestantism to which we belong have been debates about cerebral things. The doctrine of Scripture, the doctrines of grace. We have a form of worship where the central act of worship is we sit and listen to somebody giving what the world thinks of as a lecture. Now, we have a theological understanding of preaching, and I think the over-cerebralization is something that doesn't comport with embodied human existence. Bodies are important, and that's something that Protestantism, I think, has not wrestled with at the depth it should have done.
This movement, I think, has put tremendous pressure that I'm excited about, even on myself, to think more seriously, more biblically, theologically, philosophically about what it is to be a human being.
Yeah. Yeah.
And about what it is to be an embodied, that includes, that may very well include essentially being embodied. And, the resurrection of the body is an essential
Yeah.
doctrine,
Yeah.
right, to us, right? We mention it in the Apostles' Creed, right? The foremost ecumenical creed. Nevertheless, I don't know if you've experienced this at all, Carl. I have students throughout my entire career who've been born and raised in the church. They believe in the inspiration and authority of Scripture. These are wonderful young Christian men and women who didn't realize the doctrine of the resurrection of the body was an essential doctrine of their
Right.
faith.
And that plays directly to this idea that we are not embodied souls. Our souls inhabit our bodies like a spaceman inhabits a spacesuit.
Mm-hmm.
And I've said to students a number of occasions, if the resurrection wasn't important, then Jesus didn't need to rise from the dead. He could have died for our sins. We're forgiven. Why does he need to rise? And I often cite the bit from Thomas Aquinas, where Aquinas is talking about, end of time things. And he asked the question, what happens when you die? And the answer is, well, your soul goes to be with the Lord. Then he makes an interesting qualification. He says, but it isn't you.
Mm.
And what he's saying there is it's not that it isn't you in the sense that your soul is your soul. Yes, it's your unique soul. But it isn't fully you until that soul is reunited to matter, until you are embodied. So we might put it somewhat crudely and say it's part of you, but the whole you isn't in the presence of God until the resurrection, until the matter rejoins, is reunited to the soul. And I think that's something that we as Protestants need to emphasize. And sometimes in the very language we use about our souls, we can talk about our souls as if they're more real than our bodies. And I think we need to avoid that.
Look, I know I'm just kind of speculating here, but trying to sort of understand, why is God allowing these things to occur? What can the church learn from this? What is God perhaps, partially doing to teach the church here, to teach believers? And I think of the rise of the LGBTQ movement, and in particular the transgender movement, with which in some ways is continuous, but also, now we've got the emergence of AI stuff, right? That's now putting even more of a challenge on us to figure out what it is to be human. Giving us even more reason to think hard about what it is to be an embodied being.
Yeah, and I think what you're doing there as well is pointing to the fact that we're living in an age where anthropology, doctrine of what it means to be human, is the key one. Again, it's simplistic to say this, but one thing I'll say to the students when I teach church history is different epochs of church history. The whole counsel of God is the whole counsel of God, but different bits of the whole counsel of God are under pressure at different points. 4th, 5th century, it's doctrine of God, and then it's Christology. Reformation, it's sacraments, authority, justification. The modern age, I think it's what it means to be human. And so many of the questions we face today, what is a woman? That's only a complicated question because we don't know what it means to be a human being. If we could answer the question, we're mesmerized by the what is a woman question. But that is really symptomatic of a much deeper problem, and that is we've really lost track of what it means to be human beings. So I think you're absolutely right, David. Anthropology is key, and all of these technological developments are raising the anthropological question in a very, very urgent form, I think.
We also get a kind of, I don't know, repudiation, dismissal of the elderly, right? Older persons. And so I was thinking about this as I was reading through my notes, and there seems to be a connection here, right? A kind of obvious connection, right? If my sexuality and my engagement in sexual activity is so unbelievably important, then age, right, getting older is going to be looked at as just awful, right? We're going to disdain it, right? Those persons have nothing to say to us because their ability to engage in sexual activity is diminishing every day. So now we also have this massive multi-billion-dollar industry that is being dedicated to allowing persons into their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to engage in sexual activity. I'm just curious, am I crazy in thinking that there are some explanatory connections here? What do you think of all that?
No, I think you're absolutely spot on. And it's interesting that what would once have been regarded as a sort of natural decline is now seen as a medical problem.
Yeah.
Well, interpreting the symptoms of natural decline as a medical problem requires some sort of imaginative framework in the background, and I think you're onto it there. I think there are other aspects to it as well. There's a fear of old age now that we have. Um, I think there's a question mark over what to do with old people. It's interesting to me that the sexual revolution is spinning towards euthanasia now for old people.
Mm,
Uh,
mm.
Carter Sneed, who's a guy you should have on the podcast if you can get him, at Notre Dame, came out about the same time as my book, wrote a book called What It Means to Be Human. And there he's really arguing, he's talking about expressive individualism as well, but he's making the point that expressive individualism actually makes life very vulnerable at the beginning and the end. That expressive individuals tend not to see themselves as having obligations towards others. And so he sees it as lying behind the rise in abortion and then arguments for infanticide, particularly relative to children born with medical complications or difficulties of some kind, and parleying towards the destruction of the old, because we no longer feel we have an obligation towards the elderly to make them comfortable. The elderly become a burden in the same way that an unwanted pregnancy. So I think, you're absolutely correct that the sort of the sex pill industry connects to this. But I think there are other strands as well that also sort of play, not for the same reasons, but play in the same direction, leading us to fear old age, regard old age with contempt. I joke to the students that the most incomprehensible verse in the whole of the Bible today, I say, ask the students, tell me what it is. And of course, they'll point to something on the election or the Trinity or something like this. And I say, no, it's when Paul says to Timothy, let no man despise you because of your youth. He said, no, but nobody despises anybody because of their youth today. Old age is despicable. So I think you're absolutely onto something there. That is not a wild left field thing at all. I think you're correct. So actually, you will find that the late great conservative philosopher Sir Roger Scruton makes a very similar point to that somewhere. Specifically related to Viagra, I think was his target at the time, really saying, this is philosophically interesting.
Yeah.
That now an old man needs to take the blue pill in order for his life to be worth living. In the past, no, the decline of sexual potency would simply have been seen as, hey, he's getting old. But that's not what old men are meant to get up to anyway, kind of thing.
Boy, fascinating. Well, Carl, man, we not to make light of the times we live in, but in so many ways we live in an exciting time. It is an exciting time, I think, to present the gospel. I am actually weirdly, perhaps naively optimistic about what Christians can accomplish right now through of course, with the power of the Holy Spirit.
I was listening just 2 nights ago. I had the privilege of hearing John Piper preach on 2 Corinthians. And he was making a very similar point, effectively saying, we do not lose heart. And that means we don't tinker with the word. We should not allow the chaos and confusion of our times to tempt us to change the gospel. Because the gospel is the answer among our confusion, however tempting it might be to try to think, well, we need another solution at this point.
You've been listening to The Virtuous Mind, a podcast from Providence Christian College. The mission of Providence Christian College as a reformed Christian institution is to equip students to be firmly grounded in biblical truth, thoroughly educated in the liberal arts, and fully engaged in their church, their community, and the world for the glory of God and for service to humanity. We'd love to have you visit our campus. Providence Christian College is now accepting applications for the upcoming semester. Contact an admissions counselor to learn more. Visit providencecc.edu.